Let us take a moment in prayer. Gracious and loving God, bless all these words that we hear, that I speak, that they may be a blessing to you and to this community. Amen. Good morning. We've been looking at these really long passages all summer and pulling lessons out from Acts. There have been a small group that meets after service every week where we have conversations about the text from the Bible, about the sermons, about the book we've been looking at, and about some of the larger ideas. Last week, we looked at conflict that the early church leaders were having, and it was part of this ever-expanding idea, the nature of this new faith, as they just kept including more and more people. Now that somebody doesn't have to become Jewish to be part of the way, by that I mean now that you don't have to be circumcised as an adult, you don't to be a follower of Jesus, the question is begged, what does that make this new faith? What is the outward sign that marks one as part of the community? See, I think this is the question that Paul is trying to answer throughout the rest of his ministry, through his letters and his travels. He was looking to help define who this group of people was going to be. What does it mean to be a follower of Jesus? One of the things at Paul's time of Judaism, there were those who were followers, who were disciples of a particular rabbi. And the best of the best students were selected to study under the rabbi for years and to carry on what the teacher taught them when the teacher dies. Jesus had countless disciples. He had tons of people who followed him, but the best of the best were the 12. And it became them who were sent to carry on this message. See, one of the teachings in Judaism was that the disciples would be covered in the dust of their rabbi. In the ancient world, where there was no pavement, and there was no quick way to get from one place to the other, you walked everywhere, and the disciples would follow behind, closely, we hope. So closely that when they arrived where they were going, the rabbi would have kicked up dirt along the way, and the disciple would be covered in the dirt of the dust of their teacher. It would be so clear who they were following that your very clothing would bear the evidence. We are called disciples. And so then, what is our evidence? As a young person growing up in Christian communities, the Christian communities that I was part of talked a lot about discipleship. Now, I, like many of you, was part of a mainline church, so there wasn't as much conversation about that moment of salvation, but it was made very clear to me through the multiple communities that I was a part of what it meant to be Christian. That what it meant to be Christian was that I was going to have to be very different than who I currently was. I had to change who I was to be a good Christian. So let me tell you about what this looked like when I was a young person, in case you missed out on this little piece. There is the Christian, and then there is the rest of the world. Turns out it's you all. No, I'm kidding. And there are things of the world that are always in conflict with that which is Christian. And so as a consequence, we were told as young people to throw out all of our non-Christian CDs and to stop watching those terrible shows like Dawson's Creek. This is when these things were said to me. So then you commit yourself to Christian music, Christian TV, Christian movies, Christian novels. It was the active removal of non-Christian things. It was meant to help you focus on what would be the second half, the obedience. And I think on its surface, obedience is something that most people struggle with. It's the part of Christianity that seems and appears legalistic. It demands that you do or you don't do something. And as a young person, someone was always telling me about the actions and the thoughts and the words that were Christian and which ones weren't. The obedience part was the forcibly becoming a good person. And until I become a good person, the good Christian that I was supposed to be, the one who no longer struggles, who's no longer filled with doubt, who's never swearing, never says a cruel word, and never has a mean thought. And as an adult, I want desperately to push against all of this. Against all of this notion that I would have to give up anything or everything that doesn't explicitly fit into a very well-defined box of what it means to believe. And I want to push against the idea that I have to become somebody different before I can be a faithful, good, whole person. And in our modern Western culture, we generally bristle against obedience. We don't like to admit that we are not the center of our own universe. Sometimes we don't even like to admit that there is something greater than ourselves out there, or that there remains something unknown in the universe, and particularly don't want to admit that there's something that remains unknown within ourselves. We don't like the idea that we are still having to grow, that as adults, we are still going to grow and change and become, not because it is something that is just going to happen, but because it's something we're going to have to do. See, the reality is that I am going to obey and follow something. Something is going to set my direction, my thoughts, my actions. I had a friend who found that there was a difference when he was driving, when he listened to the metal that he really enjoyed, the music, metal, hard rock, rawr. But there was a difference when he was driving. When he was listening to the music that he enjoyed, this rock, this metal, he tended to respond to the other drivers around him more aggressively. And when he chose to listen to classical, there was a little more calm in his response. Sometimes these things sneak in a way. So I was listening to an interview on the reporter Clive Thompson, and he had written an article about the use of memes. Images, little images, short videos, often have writing with them. Ask your kids or your grandkids. And about how they make comments about life, culture, absurdities, and they're often used in really fun ways, except when they're not. And they have become a tool of extremist groups that use them to turn racist, sexist, homophobic ideas into what the reporter's son called, "Just funny jokes, Dad." Sometimes we don't notice what's feeding our souls. Sometimes it's less subtle. There's a couple of shows on Netflix that I'm going to reference. One of them is Insatiable. It's a new show that came out recently. And my household, my roommate and I have decided that we're not going to watch it because it has terrible reviews. And it seems to say terrible things about how young people should function, about weight, about shame, and about revenge. My roommate also refused to watch 13 Reasons Why. And I refused to watch the second season. So we've chosen not to participate in some of these things. I think about how Marcus Theaters has committed and chosen not to show the movie Slender Man in the Milwaukee County and the Waukesha County because of what happened in our communities. So maybe it's not about giving up everything and changing. Maybe it does influence us, but maybe it's not. Maybe it is about what we bring into our lives. So what is the dust that I'm going to choose to be covered in? There are choices that are to be made that will bring joy or bring harm into our lives and into the lives around us. So maybe it's the careful curation of that which feeds our souls. So we consciously and with intention curate. We make choices every day, most days. Like one makes choices at a museum or a library. And I believe that we are creative creatures because we have a creative God. And we bring in and curate and create around us. And we have to ask what brings us joy. What brings our family, our church, our communities more joy? What brings more joy into the world around us? Because I don't think it's about what we subtract from our lives, but what we add to it. And we learn from our story today the kinds of things that we might consider adding to our lives that might bring us joy, bring our community joy, and bring our world more joy. It's the marks of discipleship, the kind of dust that gets kicked up on us. We are people who welcome. Lydia welcomed the strangers into her community. And when we become people who welcome, it becomes part of that interesting question in Acts about who is it we become when we enter into these other stories. But it is an integral part of who we are as a church. Lydia showed hospitality by welcoming in these preachers into a community, and it changed everything about this small band of particularly women. She showed them hospitality by keeping them safe after they had been beat and had been released from prison. And so we welcome the stranger and the outcast because it's who Jesus was, and it's who we are called to be as followers. And this too is about adding to our lives. It's about bringing joy. And there is so much to gain. There are so many stories that remain unheard, and we have the opportunity to hear them. And not only that, we are called to give space to those stories and lift them up. We are called as disciples to bring joy into the world by bringing and calling for liberation and justice for all. We raise up those who haven't been given a voice so that their stories might be told. We march, we gather, so that those who have been captive are set free. We march at ICE, we support and feed at Pathfinders. We feed those who are hungry. We clothe those who have nothing. We do this because we know or have felt that deep river that connects us, that each is created and worthy of respect, hope, grace, and yes, even a second chance. The last 3 steps of marks of discipleship might be the hardest. The ones that we see from Lydia, Paul, Silas, and the guard. For this community, we are people of action. We like to get up, get out, do things. We are making a difference kind of people, and I celebrate that. There is, however, more. And so as we curate in worship and prayer, no matter what we do, we know we are falling at the feet of something. We are going to choose to make something our priority, and our efforts are going to support that which we invest our time, our energy, and our emotions. And when we gather for worship, we are choosing to say that this God, this Jesus, this community, and is important. In worship, we practice grace, forgiveness, vulnerability. We practice it here. Worship connects us. And prayer connects us to the universe. It connects us to the deep flow of the universe that connects all of creation. It's that flow, that river we've been singing about all summer as we get ready for prayer. We step into the eternal depths of the universe when we pray, and it connects the deep river to ourselves. When Paul and Silas met with Lydia and the other women, which any story where women get a name is excellent on its own, what they did was teach. And when Paul and Silas were in prison, they taught. And when they got home to the home of the guard, they taught. And as disciples, we learn education is key to who we are. And we embrace and we know that the Sunday school, the learning of stories, the learning to ask questions is so important to our youngest people. And I could turn this moment into a shameless plug that all of you should participate in teaching our young people, because you should. However, it's so much more. We never reach our limits of learning. We do not know all that there is to know from the stories of faith. We will never come to the stories as the same person we were before, and there is always more to know. The community here, we have so much to teach and learn from each other. I still have so much more to learn. We know so little of the world around us, and we get to continue to ask questions, to see the stories in new ways, so that we can join discussions, we participate in other adult education. We choose to intentionally go into this community and to the world learning. Our last mark of discipleship is that sometimes despite all of our best efforts, they are for naught. Paul and Silas did their work. They taught, they set the child free, and for their work, they were imprisoned. There was suffering. And we are at a weird particular place in Western Christianity that's claiming that suffering and oppression are happening, when really it's just the consequences of losing a place of dominance in the culture, or the result of living in a pluralistic society. But living like this, inviting joy, welcoming the stranger, making space for the outcast, speaking liberation, choosing life in the universe, recognizing the deep connection, and that it's not just me, seeking to continue to learn and to grow, realizing that it's going to change you. These are not the ways the world usually works, and so it will not be easy. Sometimes it does lead to suffering. Sometimes it will mean having to choose not to participate, not to join in, not to give up. Sometimes the choice is to carry on even when it's hard. It's choosing love and grace and hope, and we know that that choice has cost people everything. But struggles and suffering, they build empathy, which brings us back to connection, which brings us back to our community, to discipleship, to the work that we do for ourselves, for our family, for our church, for our communities, and for the world. They mark us. They show us the dust that we are covered in, and that it isn't about me or you or changing to fit in, that we already are. We already belong, but it will change us anyways. We add to our lives worship and prayer, justice and liberation, the welcoming of the stranger, the learning from our struggles, and we will be changed. We curate joy, we feed our souls with joy and love and forgiveness, and we become. We continue the work of becoming. From the moment we are born till we reach 100 and beyond. And so in that way, maybe discipleship isn't the burden I was told and understood it was. Maybe it is the practicing of joy, the curating of a life, the being and the becoming. Amen.